let us begin, perhaps start with a stop. For this begins at a point when I was stuck. And at the point where I was stuck, when I felt I could no longer go on writing, when the proverbial ink was no longer flowing, I started walking, moving around. In an attempt to leave, if only momentarily, if only in my mind, the room of phantoms, as Robert Balfour might say. For as my dear teacher Avital always reminded me, one has to keep in mind, respect the possibility that the movement of thought and our bodies are potentially entwined. That since thought quite possibly moves, we might have to move along to it, perhaps with it. A moving that we were attempting during many of our walks. For many of her teaching moments were conducted as we were walking in, meandering through the woods of Saas Fee in Switzerland. A walk that was always a little away, apart from the maddening crowd, as it were. A walk that was also away from the trails that Saas Fee itself was known for. The paths up the mountains that echo with the footsteps of Rousseau, Zarathustra, the monster who adopts yet declines the name of Frankenstein, Byron, Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft, Godwin, Nietzsche, many, many others. Thinking with a little distance from everyone else, from all else. For one should bear in mind that the role of a teacher is distinctly anti-public, anti-polis. As Socrates reminds us, the role of philosophy is the corruption of youth, not by turning them away from what is good, for the one who loves wisdom is also a lover of beauty and truth, but by opening the love of wisdom, by opening thought, thinking, questioning. And love in the specific sense of philia, two-way, in relation with, whilst never claiming to fully know another, whilst being open to the possibility of the other. Which suggests that this is a relationality that is reasonable, always within the boundaries of rationality, but at the same time, also open to the unknown, the potentially unknown, to the potentiality of the unknowable. And we must try not to forget that even though this is a relationship of love, it is not haphazard, not completely relying on chance. There is craft, discipline, technique involved. But even as there is craft in thinking, even as there is method in this journey of thought, Socrates teaches us that wisdom only comes to one from elsewhere, from beyond. Only comes to one at the point where the demon whispers in one's ear, which means that even as one can attempt to teach another, that even as one might be able to be taught, be open to the possibility of being taught, the teaching is limited to the manner in which one might approach wisdom. One is not, perhaps cannot be taught wisdom as such. And if teaching and learning involves an approach, involves craft, this suggests that it requires much practice, that it is only through constant repetition that one might be able to develop the skills required to open oneself to the possibility of the whisper. For Socrates never lets us forget, at the point when one hears the demon, it is the craft that becomes art. Nothing is said of the artist, of the craftsman. There is no artist, only the gestures of the possibility of art. At the point of wisdom, perhaps there is no teacher, only gestures of the possibility of teaching. Which is why Avi never sought to tell, to impose upon, to impart even, but instead always only conducted the flow of our thoughts as we move, listening to its rhythm, its rises and falls, its tempo, its time. For we should never forget that the teacher, the pedagogue, can only guide, lead the ones being taught. Thus, it is not a direct transference of information or even knowledge, but a leading by example, as it were. Where the habits of the teacher, and by extension the teacher's body, her habitus, is the very site of the teaching. Which is why Martin Heidegger reminds us that, or teaches us that, the real teacher, in fact, lets nothing else be learned than learning. His conduct, therefore, often produces the impression that we properly learn nothing from him, if by learning we now suddenly understand merely the procurement of useful information. The teacher is ahead of his apprentices in this alone, that he has still far more to learn than they. He has to learn to let them learn. The teacher must be capable of being more teachable than the apprentices. The teacher is far less assured of his ground than those who are of theirs. Her too, Martin. Always her as well. Thus, the teacher and the student are in a relationality, where they are open to the possibility of learning. And the site of this potential learning is on their bodies, which brings us back to love. And the fact that love itself is the very condition of learning. In the precise sense that even as the one who teaches professes, allowing all echoes of faith, unknowability, whispers of the divine even to resound here, she is always also an amateur. The one who teaches is the one that loves, is the one in love. Bearing in mind that love always entails a risk, it is never safe, and the one in love opens herself, subjects himself to its dangers. And at this juncture, if your spidey senses are tingling, and alarm bells are going off about the possibility that we're encroaching dangerously close to the terrain of pedophilia, they should be. For if love is the premise of learning and teaching, one should bear in mind that teaching, learning, quite possibly always already entails a fall, where the ones involved potentially do what they otherwise might not have, and they perhaps transgress not just mores, norms, but their very selves. Where to be in love is to open oneself with all that it entails. Thus, a categorical dismissal of the potential relationship between the student and the teacher, even if this relationship extends to a sexual nature, is to make teaching a profession, to divorce it from amore, from love, which is not just to sterilize the one who teaches, it is the devastation of the possibility of thought itself. And if openness to possibility is one of the conditions of thought, this also suggests that to think, one has to be potentially open to the very notion, question of thinking itself. One has to think without, before, knowing what thinking itself is. Thinking without thinking, as it were, or more precisely, thinking without deciding that it is, perhaps without naming it, thinking. Perhaps then thinking as openness to the possibility of thinking, without thinking that one knows that one has been taught what thinking is. Thus a thinking that is before, beyond, and also open to thinking, and yet only happens as one is thinking. La part de là. Which also means that one can never quite know if we truly know. That truly knowing is always already also unknowable, might well lie in the unknown. Thus, perhaps it is not just that knowing that we know is unknowable, but that unknowability is not just the limit, but also the condition of knowledge itself. That the foundation, or Abgrund if you prefer, of knowledge is its unknown, where unknowability is not its opposite, its antonym, but its own foregrounding of its limits each time it professes, testifies to its knowledge, its knowing. Which means that each profession of knowledge is always also knowledge testifying to itself, telling itself, bringing itself forth, attempting to narrate what it is. Thus always also a moment of fiction, of literature, a writing of itself. And these relationalities, questions, were continually haunting me as I was struggling to write. For even as I was attempting to rev up, to kickstart my writing with walking, one of the soundtracks that I was hearing, that I could not get out of my mind, that was on constant loop in the background, was that I was not good enough, that I should go somewhere else with what I was trying to write, with what I had not even written yet, that I should just stop writing and take a hike, as it were. After all, those of us who write constantly put ourselves before the law, even willingly submit ourselves, for instance during a dissertation process, to some sort of masochistic contract, and also to a publishing industry linked somewhat to a job market, some sort of hierarchical institutional system where we are judged, unceasingly examined, but at the same time know not whom judges us, so that there is no recourse, no real appeal to the judgment. And should one ever raise a complaint, one is told that this is the path that you have chosen, that you have to walk the walk, that it is this way or the highway. But still, regardless of the trials that one might be facing on one's walks, one must also bear in mind that even as one is able to walk, to move around, as one can attempt to roam, there are many others, as Karen Kaplan actually reminded us during her lecture on Tuesday, many others who can no longer walk, who no longer feel safe to walk, who are no longer allowed to walk. From Trayvon Martin, whose walk, whose movement was seen, was construed vindictively, racially, perhaps even stupidly, as a threat, to Michael Brown, who was told where he could or could not walk, who was ordered to stop walking, to get off the middle of the road, to civil rights marches that are cordoned, shepherded, uncivilly beaten, violently attacked, to assemblies in Mexico, Greece, Hong Kong, Oakland, amongst many, many others, that are threatened, charged upon, brutally dispersed, in order to make way for certain kinds of movements that are authorized, approved, sanctioned. So everyday occurrences where some people are, where one is told to move faster, move slower to get out of the road. Which is not to say that one should ever ask, apply for permission to walk or to stop. After all, it is, at least it should be, one's right to move, to walk. But that even as walking, movement, moving and thinking are related, have a relation with each other, this relationality can be co-opted, swallowed, perhaps digested, turned back upon us. Where instead of choosing to move, we are moved, shifted, shafted. Where instead of thinking, we are herded, flocked, maneuvered into unthinking. And these spectres were replaying in me as I was constantly proposing resolutely that I shall soon sketch and write down in a piece or sort of fantasy, which I thought I will entitle Senepa Ungkari. Even as I was continually trying to keep in mind, to remember, call to mind, to recall are these other reminders that oftentimes one finds breakthroughs, possibilities in what is closest in the everyday. For during our walks, teaching as walking, walking to teach, she reminded me to trust my instincts whenever I was trying to or preparing to write. And that sometimes the books that happened to be lying on my table, the text that I had brought in front of me, without necessarily knowing why, without necessarily even being conscious of that decision to do so, without being aware of the act of doing so, might offer me an opening into what I was attempting to think about, to meditate on. That sometimes, not only do the questions that haunt us send us into a quest, but they also open the possibility, bring with them the potential openings for a response to or responding with them. That perhaps the questions that have been opened were opened with them, quite possibly before them, or perhaps even by them. That sometimes all I had to do was to trust that what I was looking for was already in front of me, that I had yet to realize that I was seeing it, that I might have only been seeing blindly, that I might have been blind to the fact that the texts were already teaching me as I was reading them, attempting to read them, that they might have, unbeknownst to me, already been writing into. Moreover, since the whisper of the demon comes whenever it wishes to, there is also no reason to believe that one knows precisely who would teach one at any point, nor if one's teacher might even be a who. And I was pottering around the house. I looked up and saw a painting that had been hanging in front of me for the last 4 years. One that I have been looking at every day, especially during meals, and when I am reading. It hangs just above my dining table. A painting that was inexorably linked to, tied to, a taking in, a consumption, la nourriture, nourishment, revitalizing, nurturing, certainly love, perhaps even life. A painting that is ostensibly about a girl's declaration of love for, to, a squid that seems to be dead, to be lost to her as it were. A declaration that is made in the present, but I still love you. And not a claim to some imaginary future, some impossible always that one tends to hear in relation to love, particularly when it comes to utterances of love. A statement that seems to suggest not just a certain intensity of both a love and a loss that is deep, but also carries with it a certain accusation. But I still love you, which can quite easily be read as, since I still love you, why are you dead? Why are you gone? And perhaps more importantly, why have you left me? But at the same time, it is only because the squid has left her, is no longer with her, that she can make that statement. For the limp, wet tentacle of a dead giant squid is what remains of love. Not just what is left over, what stays with her after the death of the squid, but also what is still love. Love that she is quite literally holding in her hands. Perhaps opening another reading to a literal reading of I was touched by love, or even I was touched by your love. And perhaps here, we should reopen our registers to Jean-Luc Nancy's reminder that it is space that is first needed to touch, that space is the very condition of touch. And once the dossier of space is open, the notion of distance is also never very far behind, keeping in mind that if one and the other are in the same place, it is no longer a touching but a subsuming, a total consumption where the other is effaced. And now that consumption has been brought forth, one should not forget, should not efface the fact that for most of us, squids are food. But since it is not a necessity, it would rarely be a staple for anyone. This also opens the possibility that one eats squid for pleasure, enjoyment, for the love of squid. Or perhaps even, since one is only eating a particular squid at any moment, love for a squid. Not just because one has to, but because one wants to, because one desires the squid. Which also suggests that there is a gap, at least a moment, a distance, between the longing to eat the squid, even as a response to the call of the squid, and one's consumption of it. And perhaps even after physically consuming the squid, keeping in mind that desire can never be satisfied, even if the one for the squid is momentarily satiated, quelled, what remains is the love, a love that is brought forth precisely by the death of the squid that once lay in one's hand. Thus the consumption can never be total, complete. Something is always left behind, remains, but only because it was a response, and not a necessity, imperative, duty. Which suggests that in order to touch, to be touched, there must be the possibility of refusing that touch. And more than that, there has to be the possibility that one's touch might also be refused, even if one is touching, attempting to touch, a limp, wet tentacle of a dead giant squid. And perhaps what remains of love, what might still be love, what is love, is precisely the possibility of touching. Perhaps then, when she says, "But I still love you," she's not just referring to the squid, nor just telling the squid, nor anyone else that might happen to be listening in, eavesdropping as I, and now we, have been doing, of her love for it. She is also uttering the fact that her touching of it, its touching of her, touch itself, is love. And this is encompassed in her utterance precisely because the I is always already plural, a plurality that resides in grammar itself. Perhaps it is I love only because there is another within the I. A plurality that, as Maurice Blanchot teaches us, constitutes them neither out of their own singularity, nor in the view of a superior unity. An I that is not a mark nor a trace of identity, but a name, keeping in mind that the name names both one and no other, and every other with the same name but one at the same time. Which means that when one utters I, it is impossible to tell whom it refers to. Moreover, the only time one has to refer to another by her proper name, the only time that one's proper name has to be used, is in the absence of the one name, in the absence of the one whom the name refers to, in the absence of the referent of the name. Thus the I names nothing but the fact that it is named. It is named for nothing but the it that names, the it that is the name that is it. Blanchot continues, Le il is not that one, but the neuter that marks it, as le il appeals to that neuter, leads it back to the displacement without place that robs it of any grammatical place, so flat in becoming between two, several or all words, thanks to which these interrupt each other, without which they would signify nothing, but which upsets them constantly to the very silence in which they extinguish themselves. And in the neuter, it is easy to recognize in man he who is always himself and the other, the happy duality of dialogue and the possibility of communication. But it is less easy, more important perhaps, to think man, that is to say, also two, a separation that lacks unity, the leap from zero to duality, that one thus giving itself as the forbidden, the between the two. Wherein I love you is always already an I still love you, not just in the stillness that might be required to love, the moment in which one has the possibility of uttering that it is the one who loves, even if it is this I is even if this I is always already in between the one who utters and the one who is being loved, who is being called into being as the one who is loved. But also in the fact that once uttered, there is the possibility that the utterance has called forth the possibility that this love is absent, that love is absence, has passed, has taken flight, s'est envolé, thus perhaps has always been stolen from us, volé de nous. After all, the one whom we love is often the thief of our hearts. Perhaps then the duality of the dialogue and the possibility of communication is only possible due to this separation that lacks unity, this leap from zero to duality. For if the singularity of the I is a stable one, then both I's remain infinitely separated. Which is not to say that there is a complete collapse into the we. For duality still remains the singularity of each one, but a singularity that is not whole, but one that is between the two, a plural I that is both singular and at the same time always also open to the other, to another, that might not quite be completely separable from one. Another that might never be separable, even if the other is already absent, already having taken flight, perhaps having already stolen part of one, even as the flight has taken place. So even as my receptors are screaming, not just man, but also woman, Maurice, perhaps the duality in La'il is always also brings within it La'il, even if she remains silent. Or even better, perhaps she is always already silent, not because she is silenced, but that she has already taken flight, gone but not quite forgotten, always already written into La'il. Perhaps also always already written into one, quite possibly from a writing pen, a scribendo calamus. But then again, perhaps just onto me. After all, that is the risk of thinking, of thought, let alone of writing, reading out, speaking one's thoughts. For it might well be impossible to differentiate, to know, whether the thought was writing itself into one, or if it had emerged from, has always already been in one. In that one might well be one's own pen, that it is one that pertains to a pen, calamari, where one is one's own calamari, writing oneself as one is perhaps written upon, where writing might well be an inscription from another, inked into one, burned into one, marking one, where one is marked by something that burns, is caustic, combustible even. And not just the other that is in front of one, that is somewhat present to one, but the other that is absent, is named as other, is absent as she is named as another, but nonetheless still made by one, perhaps in memory of a name, and framed in a cenotaph. Where what is written, penned down, is perhaps also pinned down, not just because all writing is the inscription of a version, keeping in mind that one can only write what one knows, what one recalls, a particular memory, and that since forgetting potentially haunts all memory, not only is each particular possibly peculiar, one's own, each moment of writing might well be a setting in place, a remembering of a forgotten, or what was not there. Not in the sense of an absence, but a not yet was always already at the same time. So not that one is inscribing what is dead, for each remembrance might well be a resurrection, where one is doing this in memory of me, but that each scripting is a moment when one is quite possibly writing death. Thus always also, and here one cannot quite know if we are hearing a false echo or not, potentially a calamity, where perhaps since death, even whilst it is being written, is the unknowability that haunts whilst remaining unknown. Writing cannot know of itself, even whilst writing. Perhaps even betrays itself as writing whilst writing. not just because we write or one writes, but quite possibly because of writing, of what is betrayed by writing itself. For as Blanchot writes, what is betrayed by writing is not what writing would have to transcribe, and that could not be transcribed. It is writing itself, which betrayed, appeals to laughter, to tears, to passive impassiveness, seeking to write more passively than any passivity. So perhaps then, writing is an encounter of death with death, l'instant de ma mort. Which is not to say that the one who writes isn't involved, implicated in an encounter of death with death, of death with death, in the instant of writing itself. For as Avi teaches us in dictations, the one who takes down, who opens her ear to writing, the scrivener, secretary, is as much the writer as the one dictating. For the scribe is the one leaving the inscription as she is inscribing, leaving her mark as she marks, leaving her hand in the writing. Perhaps even hers is the mark that remains, which opens, or perhaps leaves us with the question, does one choose what one writes, or does it come to one? A question that might well remain a question, for it is not as if one can ever know, at least for sure, whether one is responding to something, or if it is a response only because one is responding. So a question which might well remain a quest that remains, which remains avant la lettre. Perhaps not just that the quest remains in the question, but that the question is also what remains of the quest. A supplementary relation, but where one cannot quite say or know or discern which is the limit, nor the necessary condition of the other. Just that both are in a relationality with, are perhaps both within each other, before the letter. Not just before the ink dries, but perhaps before the ink is even on the paper. Still moving ink. Where perhaps the difference between stillness and movement is the cut, the caesura. A separation with links, breaks whilst joining, touches, the point of reading itself. Where perhaps the only difference is the moment at which, the time in which one sees, where, when, in which one thinks one sees. Perhaps then the moment of reading is nothing other than the time of the squirt, the time when the ink squirts. Which is also the question of timing, bringing with it the dossier of the relationality between time, reading, writing, and the text. Perhaps even the question of what is the time of the text? And when does one, can one know if the text know if it is the text which calls out? And even if it does, is it us? Is it one whom it is calling out to? Or perhaps, how does one listen to a text if one doesn't know whether the call is even for one? If one is only eavesdropping? Keeping in mind that the difference between hearing and listening might well be a cut. That, as Werner Hamacher might say, one only listens when one ceases to hear. And when I question you, is it to give you the gift of speech or to take it from you? In speaking with you, with another, by attending to the speech of another, does one have to inevitably listen? Écouter, couper, cut. After all, every moment of choice, every moment one chooses, every response to a particular call might be nothing other than one attuning oneself to the call of silence. Thus, always already a certain act of faith. One which Michel Foucault speaks about, or if one were feeling a little cheeky, one could say confesses, during an interview to Claude Bonnefoy, and he says, "One day in Madrid, I had been fascinated by Velázquez's Las Meninas. I'd been looking at the painting for a long time, just like that, without thinking about talking about it someday, much less of describing it, which at the time would have seemed derisive and ridiculous. And then one day, I don't recall how, without having looked at it since, without even having looked at the reproduction, I had this urge to write about the painting from memory, to describe what was in it. As soon as I tried to describe it, a certain coloration of language, a certain rhythm, a certain form of analysis especially, gave me that impression that near certainty, false perhaps, that I had found exactly the right language by which the distance between ourselves and the classical philosophy of representation and the classical ideas of orders and resemblance would come into focus and be evaluated. That's how I began to write The Order of Things. A call not just of memory, but from a memory of what could well have not been the thing itself. Perhaps that is the very condition of the order of things. Or even that is the order of things. The order that comes from the things, not just les mots et les choses, but les mots avant les choses. Which is not to say that words and things are necessarily separate. For one should try to never forget that words matter. Should attempt to never forget the materiality of words, perhaps even of thought. Insofar as an idea is translated, led, perhaps even betrayed into language. Where to Socrates' chagrin, eikos and eidos might well be somewhat indistinguishable. A worry, a warning about representation that could only come about through writing, through representation, through faithfulness to his teaching, his teacher's teaching, through Plato's act of infidelity. Perhaps then words that we see, hear, read are traces of this infidelity to thought, marks of a thought of infidelity, remains of a thought bringing itself before us, presenting itself to us. Or perhaps it is only one that thinks that it is before us. It is one that is calling what is before us thought, speaking for it as thought, as if it were thought. Thus, not just words standing in for thought, in place of thought, but that the one who reads, sees, hears, is speaking for, speaking in place of what she is attempting to respond with. Prosopopoea. Where reading is perhaps an animation of, where reading is animating thought, where reading is necromancy. A reanimation that might well be a desecration, an act of complete infidelity, but one born of an attempt to respond to with, an act born of absolute fidelity. Which might be why, as we were just about to walk out of the forest in Saas Fee, as I was asking Avi how to respond to a block in writing, to deal with the dreaded writer's block, she turned to me and said, "Perhaps you just need to move your books around. Animate them to learn from them, to open oneself to learning from them, being literate to them. Whilst never forgetting that even as one might have been the one who has taken the books off a shelf from the bookshop, a library, from the interwebs, and laid them on one's desk, bed, table, one's reasons for doing so, and those of the books themselves, might not quite be the same. Particularly if the register of sequence, relationality, order of things, of words, les choses avant les mots, ou même les choses sans les mots, is open. Thus, even as animation might be taking place, who is animating what, or what is animating whom, remains a question that is quite possibly beyond one. Perhaps always ready to return to Avi's teaching, an act in which one has to trust oneself. Thus, perhaps always already a relationality of trust between one and one's books. For even our great archivist Foucault teaches us, for the order of things, I used materials I had gathered in the preceding years almost at random, without knowing what I would do with it, with no certainty about the possibility of ever writing an essay. In a way, it was like examining a kind of inert material, an abandoned garden of some sort, an unusable expanse, which I surveyed the way I imagined the sculptor of old, the sculptor of the 17th or 18th century, might contemplate, might touch the block of marble he didn't yet know what to do with. Or as sculptor, teacher, the Salian brother, Joseph McNally, constantly teaches, the work emerges from the material. Foucault continues in a line, sentence, speech from before. After all, this is me reading Bonnefoy writing, transcribing, being the scrivener to his conversation with Foucault. In one sense, my head is empty when I begin to write, even though my mind is always directed towards a specific object. My mind, mon esprit, l'esprit, spirit. Perhaps then also, my mind always being directed towards a specific object. Where writing, my writing, the moment when I write, is an attempt to listen to this directing, this guiding. After all, for me, for Foucault, but also for me, writing is an extremely gentle activity. Hush. I get the impression of velvet when I write. Ultimately, I don't write because I have something in mind. I don't write to show what I have already demonstrated and analyzed for myself. Writing consists essentially of doing something that allows me to discover something I hadn't seen initially. When I begin to write an essay or a book or anything, I don't really know where it's going to lead, or where it'll end up, or what I'm going to show. I only discover what I have to show in the actual movement of writing, as if writing specifically meant diagnosing what I had wanted to say at the very moment I began to write. I don't know. In any event, it involves an activity of language that is extremely profound for me, where there is no writing, only writing, where, for me, writing is a wandering after death, and not a path to the source of life. It is in this sense that my language is profoundly anti-Christian, probably more so than the themes I continue to evoke. Which might be why, for me, for you, Michel, and for me, writing is an extremely gentle activity. Hush, I get the impression of velvet when I write. With the soundless sound of pen sliding, walking, across paper, fingers tapping, treading, on, over a keyboard, throughout which all kinds of inaudible voices seem to sound and echo, and all sorts of visible and invisible figures roam. Music out of the primeval world, from whence I cannot tell, stole on my ear. Where perhaps the one writing, the scrivener, me, we, are doing nothing but attempting to inscribe the unheard, and the unhearable, the silent sound of the moving, the movement of ink. Where to echo Alain Sixou, my teachers, one of Avi's teachers, one of my favorite writers, speaking about writing, about her writing, about how she writes. Quickly, and without a sound, I pick up the pad that doesn't leave my bedside, and the large nipped pen with which you can write big and quickly across the paper. And I noted the first line, the coming dictated to me, filling in the darkness, the great page at tremendous speed with these inestimable phrases, leaven of the book, gift of the gods, whose names I don't even know. Squirt. Ou, ce n'est pas un calme, but perhaps always already ink.